I want to start today by telling you about my friend Leo. So, Leo and I first met, we had a really funny conversation on these metal bleachers at our new middle school in 7th grade. And after one of these really good conversations, he called me that night and he asked me to the 7th grade dance. And it was just that weekend. And I went on that Saturday night by the stone wall where the buses let off. And I waited for a while, and Leo stood me up. Only guy ever. Stood me up. And after a while, I was like, well, I might as well go to the dance. It's right here. And I go in, and there's Leo. And I'm like, Leo? And he's like, eh. And that's how Leo and I became friends. Now, Leo and I hung out a lot in the years after. We'd get burritos, and sometimes we would just talk after school when we weren't doing anything. But we spent a lot of time because we were in the theater together, in the tech crew. And that leaves a lot of time for talking as you're measuring and sawing and hammering and sanding and painting. We became pretty good friends. We have one of those at home. And Leo had this really smart mind, really intelligent. He became a lawyer, of course. And he was so unusual and interesting. And I don't know quite how he did this, but I guess he didn't love our high school. It just wasn't the place where he was really flourishing. And somehow, I still don't quite understand how this is possible. Instead of attending his senior year at our high school, he got a master's in Japanese from Cornell instead. And then he showed up to our graduation. We're like, Leo, where have you been? He's like, not here. But the really kind of interesting thing, the thing that really makes Leo unique in my life, is Leo has a thing for my boyfriends. It's true. I had this relationship in high school, and at 17, Leo and I, and my boyfriend and I, and my boyfriend and Leo, and then all of us together had these conversations of, was there room for Leo in our relationship? And I thought we handled that like really good adults. And then that kind of kept going, and we saw each other in college and after college, and Leo did this wonderful thing at 4 in the morning or 5 in the morning after a great night in New York City. We'd be out as friends, and we'd go to a diner, and I'd order a grilled cheese with tomato in it and a pickle on the side, and he would just pay for everyone's meal with his parents' credit card. Yes. And then a little later on, we're hanging out again. Leo, again, has a thing for my boyfriend, and which, in all fairness, Leo introduced us, so I guess he got there first. And we were going to have dinner all together. And Leo and I were talking, and I think I must have really liked this guy, and because I was thinking about marriage. And I was like, I wonder how old I'll be when I get married. What about you, Leo? How old will you be when you get married? And he's like, And I was like, no, don't you have any ideas? And I kept on kind of probing a little. And he just said, I don't know that I'll ever get married. And I thought, you'll never get married? And it was only a little after that conversation I thought, is Leo thinking he might never get married because right now he's legally not allowed to get married? And this conversation took place in early 2003. And I realized that conversation he and I were having, we were holding different perspectives. Leo's perspective was the perspective of the probable. He would probably never have the legal right to marry. And I had the perspective of the possible. It's possible he will get the legal right to marry. And I think one difference for this was that I was a Unitarian Universalist. And I had seen how the churches I'd been part of ever since middle school had been marching and rallying for gay rights. And our denomination, for the last 3 years, had been part of a movement pushing, in fact, an integral part of the movement pushing for marriage equality in Massachusetts. In fact, of the 14 people who filed a lawsuit in Massachusetts asking for the right to vote, 7 of them were UUs, including a staff person at the UUA. I had seen Bill Sinkford, who was our Unitarian Universalist Association president, the first black president of the UUA. He thought he was going to come in, he told me recently, he was going to come in and we were going to work on race. And he said, and I was blessed to be asked to work on marriage equality. And he was going on TV shows to show that there were religious black male clergy who affirmed love in all its forms and relationships. He said, I don't know that I changed anyone's mind. And I was thinking, I bet if there was a black youth hearing that your body is loved and that your love is sacred to give, probably meant a lot to them. So I was holding on to the possibility. And right then, just as Leo and I were kind of across the table in our perspective, that year was also a really interesting year. Well, let me back up and say, Leo had every reason for thinking that his denial of rights and the denial of respect for his relationships was a valid position. In 1993, that same school year when he asked me to that dance, Hawaii actually, the Hawaii State Supreme Court said that the state constitution said that people in their state had a right to marry regardless of the sex of the person they were marrying, i.e. you can marry same-sex relationships. And they said, but we need to put like good, I don't really understand this because I'm not a lawyer, but like we're gonna send it to trial to really figure out what that means. And the backlash, right? So in the 3 years between when the Hawaiian State Supreme Court issued that and when the trial actually happened, those 3 years, the right-wing backlash grew really strong. DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, passed in 1996. The Hawaiian case and trial went down in flames. Hawaiians got all rallied and they voted on a referendum that Hawaiians said, we will not have same-sex marriage in our state. So the one time it kind of went up as a little trial balloon, it was like, poof, 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 poof. When Leo and I had that conversation, sodomy laws were still in effect in 14 states. That meant you were criminalized for having an intimate relationship of someone of your own sex. I had a congregant in Indianapolis who, a few years after my conversation with Leo, her mother called the police when she was found out making out with a girlfriend in her home. Her mother called the police on her. So Leo was at a moment when things did not look good. But I'll tell you, the people who believed in human dignity were not giving up. And what they did should be a model for us right now, which is why I want to talk about this. So when they said, it seems like we take like 3 inches forward and we're sent back 3 feet. We need to really be strategic here. And we need to figure out where we can make some progress and not lose it. And they looked all around and they said, we think it's the Northeast. We think it's the Northeast. Vermont had a little trial balloon in 1999, and their Supreme Court said that they were almost there. They said denying same-sex couples the right to marriage seems like you're depriving them of legal rights. Maybe those legal rights don't have to be marriage. right? Maybe we could come up with something else, maybe the civil union, but they were willing to acknowledge at least that there were legal rights. And they began, the LGBTQ strategist said, we have to be really careful here. And they decided to pick Massachusetts, in part because Massachusetts was generally more liberal, because it had a more secular faith-based group that could do buy-in, and they had passed a number of anti-discrimination laws of different sorts. And so between 2000 and 2003, they spent millions of dollars organizing, building networks, working on public information campaigns, working on the legislature, putting forth legal arguments, until in 2003, the Supreme Court Justice of Massachusetts, Margaret Marshall, wrote, "Our state constitution forbids the creation of second-class citizens." We could do more than that, right? Yeah. That is a great line for us to remember. Is this law that's in existence, does it create second-class citizens in some way? Is the law being considered before us create second-class citizens? And Massachusetts held on, and it became actually a culmination of a strategy that it reaffirmed the strategy that the LGBTQ strategists had identified. They just said, we're going to go for a 10-10-10-20 plan in 20 years. Between the year 2000 and 2020, we want 10 states where the legislatures have adopted marriage equality, 10 states where there's civil unions, 10 states where there's some kind of anti-discrimination legislation, and 20 states where there's like a little softening of the ground. So, and Massachusetts was the first step in saying it's possible to make progress in that plan. But it was not easy. It was not easy. And so they said, let's just start putting this Massachusetts model other places. And they said, sometimes this is going to happen. They first thought this could happen through the courts. Just like Massachusetts, kind of being inspired by Justice Marshall in Massachusetts. And so they took it to state Supreme Courts, including here in Maryland. And Maryland said, according to the Supreme Court, the 14th Amendment doesn't protect LGBTQ people. So Maryland, if you want those protections, you have to do them in the state legislature. And here is a really important lesson as we do this work. Plans are good, pivoting is better. When you run up against a wall, don't necessarily keep throwing yourself up against it. Pivot and go around it. So what did we do in Maryland? We pivoted, amen, thank you. And we began to organize. And that included the Unitarian Universalist Legislative Ministry, who worked at it and worked at it. And we played a political game too. Money started to pour in to local politicians, and more politicians were willing to run to be elected on the promise that they would support marriage equality and LGBTQ rights, including our governor here. So in 2007, Maryland Supreme Court said nope. And in 2012, our legislature passed it, and we became the first state on a public referendum where the people said yes to marriage equality, okay? In this time, public perception went from significantly not interested in supporting LGBTQ rights to a supermajority doing so. So part of it was this pivoting. The second part is they made a change in their strategy. In the beginning, they were just talking about the rights. Do we have equality before the law? Should people have the same benefits that you get from the government? And what they realized is this is so much more than just getting what you need or what is fair or what is right. And they took a page out of their own community's playbook. They said, we have to show up as full people. I think they probably were inspired by Harvey Milk, from who in the 1970s and 80s and 90s was really powerful, both at saying within the gay community, we have to be willing to come together. We have to overcome our fear to even be a community to ourselves, and then finally go to step forward. We have to believe in our community enough to come out. Call the people you love and say, I am gay. Will you be with me? And that's essentially what they began to do. They began to move from arguing for equality or equity before the law to saying, let's be a community in which there's human flourishing. And so they began to tell stories. And one of my favorite ones is of Dean and Jonathan, who Dean was 38 and Jonathan was 41, and they were like, we can't believe at this age, like we never thought I'd be married 3 times. Thankfully, it's to each other. The first time they got married was in 2000. For 3 years, they planned their wedding. That is a lot of work. They picked colors. They had 170 guests. It was everything their dreams could imagine. And of course, it wasn't a legal wedding. And so when Mayor of San Francisco, Gavin Newsom, said, our city's going to start issuing marriage licenses, come down. They got married right under the big clock tower at City Hall, and they loved that because they felt like the clock was saying, it's your time. And they got those marriage licenses signed, and they got married, and 6 months later, they got a letter in the mail saying their marriages were no longer legally recognized. That was in 2004. And so they said, well, where can we be legally married? And they began to look at Oregon, who was like taking it up, and it was looking really possible. And they were like, we're going to go to Oregon and get married for the 3rd time. And their friends were like, how many times are you going to get married? And they shared as many as it takes for it to stick. It's because of people like Dean and Jonathan that the Supreme Court moved beyond, included but moved beyond recognizing that same-sex marriage was just about equality or rights. It was about our fundamental humanness. Justice Kennedy wrote for the majority, no union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. In forming a marital union, 2 people become something greater than once they were. As some of the petitioners in these cases demonstrate, marriage embodies a love that may endure even past death. It would misunderstand these men and women to say they disrespect the idea of marriage. Their plea is that they do respect it so deeply that they seek to find its fulfillment for themselves. Their hope is not to be condemned to live in loneliness, excluded from one of civilization's oldest institutions. They ask for equal dignity in the eyes of the law. The Constitution grants them that right. And that was in 2015. One of the wildest things is they went from in 1999, well, let me put it this way, in 1998, when Matthew Shepard was killed, my husband and I went to the place in Wyoming where he was killed. There's grass and wide open skies and a lonely fence. Our community went from that moment to making a plan for things to be different and thinking it's going to take more than 20 years to 15 years later having marriage equality. Things can be surprising, and just when we feel like things are only getting worse, that might be the seeds of recognizing that we need to organize to make things that much better. As so many people said in that moment when the Supreme Court issued that decision, in the end, my dear ones, love wins, and Leo can finally get married. Amen.